Long before the floodwaters swallowed the earth, long before the towering giants cast their shadows across the land, there was a secret so dark, so profound, that even the heavens trembled in silence. A union forged in defiance, a breaking of the sacred order, so disruptive, it summoned the fiercest guardian of heaven itself. Michael, the archangel, mighty and relentless, was not called to battle armies, but to silence a sin that whispered through the ages. What was this hidden corruption so powerful, it could shake the very foundations of heaven and earth? What secret union threatened the purity of creation itself? And why did Michael's mission lead him not to fight, but to silence? This was no ordinary story, it is a revelation that challenges what we think we know about love, power, and divine justice. What shadows lurk behind the tales of giants and fallen ones? What role did mortal women play in a drama that blurred the line between heaven and earth? To understand Michael's shocking charge, we must step into a place where love wore the mask of horror, and where the boundaries of God's order were crossed in silence. A place where destinies were forever changed. Are you ready to uncover the truth hidden in the silence? Let's dive in. Archangel Michael's shocking act against the wives of fallen angels. Chapter 1, The Forbidden Unions. Before the floodwaters reshaped the earth, before judgment rained down from the heavens, there was a moment in history so catastrophic, so unnatural, that the earth itself groaned under its weight. It wasn't a war of nations or a rebellion of men, this was something deeper. Something ancient. A distortion not just of behavior, but of blood. A violation not just of law, but of design. It was here that the heavenly descended into the earthly, not to lift mankind higher, but to pull them into ruin. The Watchers, once majestic beings appointed to observe, stepped beyond their assignment. These were not random acts of lust, they were deliberate decisions. Calculated invasions. The fallen chose human women not out of affection, but for domination. These were spiritual invasions masked as intimacy. They breached the boundary God Himself had drawn between the divine and the human. And in doing so, they planted a seed, one not blessed, but cursed. The Nephilim were not merely children. They were the product of rebellion, hybrid beings birthed from corrupted unions. They came into the world not with innocence, but with violence. Their presence was not a blessing to the earth, but a threat to the very prophecy of salvation. Because through the human bloodline, God had promised a Redeemer. A seed. But what happens when that bloodline is poisoned? What happens when divine purpose is mixed with defiance? It was more than intermingling, it was interference. The fallen weren't just trespassing into human affairs. They were attempting to abort destiny. To corrupt the womb that heaven had preserved for the coming of the Messiah. These were not love stories. These were strategic moves to defile what was holy and delay what was prophesied. And their offspring walked the earth with terrifying power. Anak, Og, Sion, giants of old. Their names are not fables, but scriptural markers of what once roamed the earth. In Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 to 11, we read of the Anakim, described as great and tall, feared by many. Og, the king of Bashan, whose bed was made of iron and stretched over 13 feet long, is remembered in Deuteronomy 3 verse 11. And Sion, king of the Amorites, whom Israel confronted in battle, appears in Numbers 21:33. These were not legends. These were real, living beings, proof of a union never ordained by heaven. The Bible paints this picture with sobering clarity. Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4 tells us, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." And in 2 Peter 2, For to 5, we are warned that God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Their aim was clear, to corrupt the promise before it could be fulfilled. Just as the serpent once deceived Eve, whispering lies that opened the gate to sin, so too did these fallen ones deceive, take, and plant something in the earth that was never meant to grow. And the women, they became unwilling vessels of this destruction. Used not just in body, but in purpose. Chosen not to be cherished, but to be altered. And heaven watched in grief. But among those who beheld the unraveling was Michael, the Archangel, the guardian, the protector of God's people. His eyes were not only on the watchers, but on the wombs. For it was the seed they carried that would determine the fate of generations. This was the great sabotage before the flood, an assault on the lineage of life itself. An invasion into the bloodstream of prophecy. But the earth had seen too much, and it could no longer stay silent. And the earth groaned, not because of the giants, but because of the weight of what it carried. Chapter 2, The Cry of the Earth. The rise of the Nephilim did not just disturb the peace of the earth, it defiled the very essence of creation. Their presence introduced a terror that had no precedent, a violence that went beyond warfare, a dominion that wasn't political but spiritual. These hybrid beings, born of a forbidden union, brought with them a reign of fear, not by decree, but by their very existence. They stood as living monuments of rebellion, mighty in size, but monstrous in appetite. What began as a corruption of blood quickly became a corruption of behavior. They devoured without restraint, turning even against mankind, consuming flesh not only in war but in ritual and pleasure. Cities were built in their honor. Songs were sung to their strength. They hunted both beasts and men, and when there was no longer enough to consume, they turned against each other. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, became spectacle. Mothers buried sons. Fathers watched daughters vanish. And over time, what was once horror became culture. The people did not merely tolerate the wickedness, they admired it. Their hearts had turned, not slowly, but willingly, from the Creator to the created. Worship shifted. No longer did men lift their eyes to the heavens. They lifted their eyes to the giants. They bowed not to the Lord, but to the Nephilim, these perversions of what it meant to be divine. The image of God in man was despised, while the unnatural strength of these fallen offspring was exalted. The altars of Yahweh were neglected, while the names of men like Arba, the father of Anakim, as recorded in Joshua 14 verse 15, were carved into stone in memory. Arba became more than a name, he became a legacy of defiance. His lineage, his power, and the terror he passed on to Canaan was not hidden, it was celebrated. This was no longer about giants alone. This was about a shift in spiritual allegiance. Humanity had handed over its soul. Not by force, but by pride. As in the days of Jezebel, the spirit of seduction had spread. Just as she led Israel to embrace Baal and forsake the commandments of God, so too did this ancient generation embrace the strength of giants and forsake the fear of the Lord. Jezebel did not conquer by the sword, but by influence. She turned hearts. She corrupted altars. And so did this generation, turning worship into entertainment, sacrifice into spectacle, and covenant into compromise. And as this darkness spread across the earth, creation itself began to respond. The ground that once yielded fruit now drank blood. The mountains that once echoed with songs now trembled beneath screams. As it was written, the earth shall disclose her blood and shall no more cover her slain, Isaiah 26 verse 21. Long before the judgment came, the ground had already begun to testify. Just as Abel's blood cried out from the soil in Genesis 4 verse 10, now the blood of thousands, perhaps millions, rose up as one voice. A voice of vengeance. A cry for justice. And the watchers above, the loyal ones, the faithful hosts of heaven, stood still, awaiting a word. Awaiting the sound that would call judgment down. But heaven does not act without cause. Heaven responds to the cries of the earth, the cries of the righteous, the cries of those forgotten in the madness of a corrupt world. And in this moment, as the blood stained the earth and the voices of the slain rose like incense, the time for silence was over. And so, the heavens were no longer still. A message was sent forth. A mission was commissioned. But this was no ordinary message. It would not be delivered by wind or whisper, but by the sword of one who stands closest to the throne. One whose presence alone strikes fear into the darkness. Judgment was coming. But first, a messenger had to draw his sword. What was this divine assignment given to Michael, the mighty protector? What burden would he bear in the face of such corruption? The answer lies just beyond the veil, in a mission that would shake heaven and earth alike. Chapter 3, Michael's Divine Assignment. In the vastness of heaven's realm, a moment came appointed by the Almighty, a moment when words were no longer enough, when mercy's gentle calls could no longer hold back the tide of corruption. It was then that God sent forth his appointed prince, Michael. Michael was not just a warrior clad in celestial armor. No, he was a purifier sent with a mission that reached far beyond battle. His task was to confront the children born of a forbidden union, a lineage twisted by defiance and rebellion. These children carried within them a legacy that threatened the very order of creation, a legacy of giants who walked the earth and cast shadows of fear and destruction. This was no ordinary fight. Michael's mission was to sever this corrupted lineage from the thread of eternity itself. He was sent not just to destroy, but to cleanse, to separate the unclean from the holy and to protect what remained pure in God's sight. The weight of this divine assignment was heavy. It required strength beyond flesh and blood, a power that could restore what had been broken. In the unseen spiritual realm, Michael contended with mighty forces. He faced the Prince of Persia, a dark power that sought to influence the earth and its people. This battle, recorded in the book of Daniel, revealed Michael's role as protector of God's people, standing firm against the enemy's advance. And in the vision of Revelation, Michael led the heavenly host in war against forces bent on disrupting God's plan, casting down darkness with unyielding authority. But even amid war and judgment, Michael's mission was never only about destruction. There was remembrance. He remembered the women. Women caught in the middle, mortal vessels whose wombs carried the seeds of defiance. These women bore the weight of choices that would ripple through generations, giving birth to giants who shook the earth and challenged the divine order. Michael's judgment was not only to break the power of their offspring but to restore the balance shattered by this corruption. Behind this story lies the name Azazel, spoken quietly in the shadows of Scripture, a figure bound and held accountable for leading many astray. The corruption had names, it had histories, and it demanded the firm hand of divine justice. Michael was both fierce and merciful. He wielded the sword to sever, yes, but also to purify and protect. His mission was to cleanse the earth, to guard what was sacred, and to make way for redemption. The prophet Daniel foretold a day when Michael would stand up for God's people in their darkest hour, a time of great trial and deliverance. Michael's steadfastness remains a beacon of hope, a reminder that even judgment carries a promise of restoration. This story, this divine assignment, echoes through eternity, calling us today to remember the weight of our choices. The battle fought then still rages now, and the charge given to Michael calls us to guard what is holy and to reject all that corrupts. Judgment is never only destruction. Sometimes, it is remembrance. And Michael remembered the women. These women, caught between realms, were more than mere bystanders. Their lives, their bodies, bore a burden not of their making but one that would echo through generations. The very wombs that carried the giants were places of sorrow and consequence. And Michael's role toward these women was both just and compassionate. He came to sever the ties that bound them to the corrupted seed they had borne, to release their souls from the chains of defiance. His task was to purify what had been defiled in their lives, to ensure that their torment and the dark legacy they carried would not continue unchecked. He did not destroy their existence but confronted the spiritual consequences woven through their bloodlines, breaking the power that sought to perpetuate the rebellion. Michael acted as a divine purifier, separating the women's fate from that of their fallen offspring, guarding the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. His sword was the instrument of severance, cutting the cords of corruption while preserving the possibility of redemption. Yet, the story of these women, and what became of them, is not one easily told or forgotten. It holds mysteries that linger in the shadows of Scripture and whispers of ancient judgment. Their fate remains a question that echoes through time, calling us to look deeper, to seek beyond the surface, and to understand the full scope of Michael's divine assignment. The chapter is not yet closed. What became of these women, caught in a fate between heaven and earth? Chapter 5, The Pattern in the End Times. There is a pattern, a divine design woven through history, that repeats itself in the end times. It is a shadow cast from ancient days, a warning carved into the fabric of Scripture. The story of Michael, the fallen ones, and the women who were drawn into forbidden union is not just a tale from the distant past. It is alive, breathing still in the world today. The enemy no longer seeks union with flesh alone, but with something far more precious, our hearts, our minds, our very souls. This ancient deception has not disappeared, it has merely changed its face, wearing new garments to disguise itself. It is subtle, crafty, and dangerous. It promises power, influence, belonging, but beneath the surface lies corruption. In Revelation, the Spirit reveals a woman clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones. She sits upon many waters. They call her the great harlot, the mother of harlots. This woman is not just a figure of flesh and blood, but a symbol of corrupted authority, spiritual seduction, and rebellion against God's holiness. Her power is intoxicating, her influence far-reaching. And in the letters to the churches, there is a warning about a spirit, Jezebel, who leads God's people into compromise, into sin under the guise of love and acceptance. This spirit whispers lies that entice and entrap, just as the forbidden unions of old did. It calls to hearts, inviting them into covenant without full knowledge of the cost. The Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians that deception often comes as light, an angel of light. How easily we can be blinded when darkness wears the cloak of truth. How easily we can be drawn into alliances, partnerships, and beliefs that seem righteous, but in reality, wage war against God's kingdom. Jesus himself said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Those days were marked by the breaking of divine order, by unions that blurred the line between the holy and the profane. Are we not seeing the same brokenness today? Not always with the same outward forms, but with the same spiritual reality, a calling away from God's pure path toward false promises and counterfeit authority. This is the question each soul must ask: am I unknowingly in covenant with something that wars against God? Have I allowed my heart to be joined with lies disguised as truth? The spiritual unions of the end times are not always visible. They are often in the agreements we accept quietly, the idols we worship in secret, the voices we listen to more than God's. And so, the voice of Michael still echoes across the ages, not in thunder or invisible might, but in a solemn warning. To those with eyes to see and ears to hear, guard your heart. Discern the spirits. Reject the counterfeit. Return to the pure love and justice of God. The ancient story is not merely history, it is a living word, a call to vigilance. For the battles of the past are not finished. The war for the soul continues. And those who stand firm in truth, those who cling to God's unchanging word, will hear the call and be saved. Will you listen? Will you heed the warning that echoes through time? Will you stand in the power of God's protection, as Michael stood, unwavering and strong? If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts below. Do you believe these unions are happening again today? Subscribe now to journey deeper into spirit-led biblical truths that will strengthen your faith and ignite your soul.